The cold Boston wind cut through the sidewalk cafe just as a police officer stepped toward a quiet man in a dark suit and said, "Let me see your ID." Most people looked away. A few didn't. Cameras quietly began recording. The officer thought it was just another routine stop. He didn't know the man he was confronting was a civil rights lawyer, and he didn't realize the moment would soon reach far beyond that street corner. What happened next didn't begin with shouting. It began with calm witnesses who stayed and truth that refused to stay hidden. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if you believe courage and justice still matter in everyday life, subscribe. This story is for you. Snow piled along the Boston sidewalks, and the wind rattled the small metal cafe tables like loose coins in a forgotten pocket. The outdoor seating area of Harbor Street Coffee looked almost abandoned, the transparent plastic windshields bending slightly with every gust. A row of outdoor heaters glowed orange, fighting a losing battle against the sharp February cold. People who had to be outside moved quickly, shoulders raised, heads down, as if the weather itself were watching them. Only a few customers chose to sit, and among them was Marcus Reed. Marcus Reed, 48 years old, sat upright at a small round table, his posture straight in a way that suggested discipline learned long ago and never forgotten. He was tall, just over 6 feet, with a broad but lean build that gave him an air of quiet authority. His dark charcoal suit was tailored perfectly, the fabric smooth, even beneath the thick navy wool overcoat he wore to shield himself from the cold. A gray scarf wrapped neatly around his neck, and black leather gloves rested beside his coffee cup. His face carried sharp, defined lines, trimmed beard, close to the skin, and eyes that held the calm patience of someone accustomed to tense rooms and difficult conversations. Years earlier, a civil rights case he had lost, one involving a young client who had been wrongfully detained, had carved a permanent layer of restraint into his personality. Since then, Marcus had trained himself to remain calm, first react later. He checked his watch not impatiently, but with the steady rhythm of someone measuring time rather than chasing it. He was waiting for a meeting, one that could open a new legal complaint involving misconduct cases in the district. Even here, sitting alone with a cup of black coffee, he carried the quiet awareness that his work often placed him in the path of uncomfortable encounters. Still, the morning felt peaceful enough. For a moment, he allowed himself to simply watch the snow swirl past the plastic windscreen. Across the street, a patrol cruiser slowed near the curb before rolling forward again. Marcus noticed it only in passing, the way city residents notice traffic lights without attaching meaning to them. That changed 3 minutes later. Officer Daniel Harper stepped onto the sidewalk with heavy, deliberate strides. Harper was in his early 50s, thick-necked and broad-shouldered. Not from athletic strength, but from decades of standing in command positions that shaped posture more than muscle. His shaved head reflected the yellow cafe lighting faintly, and his pale skin was reddened slightly by the cold. The Navy police uniform fit tightly across his midsection, the polished badge on his chest shining brighter than the worn stitching around the edges. Harper had built his reputation in the department as firm a word supervisors liked to use when they meant aggressive but effective. A suspension early in his career after a heated arrest that turned into a complaint had only hardened his belief that hesitation invited disrespect. He scanned the outdoor seating area in the automatic way officers sometimes do, but his gaze slowed when it reached Marcus. Something about the stillness of the man, well-dressed, composed, unmoving in the cold, caught his attention. Harper's expression shifted not dramatically, but just enough to show curiosity turning into suspicion. He adjusted his duty belt, then walked toward the table. Marcus noticed the approach immediately. Experience had sharpened that instinct. His first reaction was not fear, but calculation posture, neutral hands, visible movements slow. He had spent years advising clients how to behave during encounters like this, and now the same quiet checklist ran through his own mind. Stay calm. Stay polite. Say little. Morning Harper said, his tone carrying the faint edge of someone who expected the conversation to go only one way. Marcus looked up calmly. "Good morning, officer." Harper paused beside the table, rather than passing by. Up close, Marcus could see the faint lines at the corners of the officer's eyes, creases formed less by smiling than by squinting into confrontations. Harper's gaze moved from the suit to the gloves to the briefcase resting beside the chair. Cold winds slid through the plastic barrier, fluttering the corner of a napkin on the table. The heater hummed softly overhead. Two college students seated several tables away glanced over, then quickly pretended not to watch. "You waiting for someone?" Harper asked. "Yes," Marcus replied evenly. "A meeting." The officer nodded slowly, though his posture remained planted, feet shoulder-width apart, hands resting near his belt, in a stance that signaled ownership of the space. Marcus had seen that posture before, sometimes in court testimony, sometimes in surveillance footage, often just seconds before a situation escalated. Harper's eyes drifted again across the table, lingering for a moment on the legal folder, partially visible inside Marcus's leather briefcase. A small silence followed, long enough to make the nearby students look up again. Marcus took a slow sip of coffee, aware that the moment had shifted from casual interaction to inspection. Inside, he felt the familiar tightening in his chest, not panic, but the quiet readiness that came from knowing how quickly ordinary mornings could change. He reminded himself that patience often won battles faster than argument. Harper stepped a little closer, boots scraping lightly against the salted pavement. "Cold morning to be sitting outside," he said. Marcus allowed a faint smile. Sometimes the quiet is worth the cold. The officer studied him for another second, eyes narrowing slightly, as if trying to place something he couldn't quite identify. The wind lifted again, rattling the metal chairs in a hollow clatter that echoed down the nearly empty street. Somewhere inside the cafe, the doorbell chimed as another customer entered, but outside, the tension seemed to stay behind. Harper drew a slow breath, then shifted his weight forward, preparing to continue the conversation. Marcus sensed the change instantly. The calm morning, the coffee, the drifting snow, something in the air had just tilted almost imperceptibly toward confrontation. And for the first time that morning, he wondered whether the meeting he was waiting for would begin sooner than expected. Officer Daniel Harper did not sit, did not step back, and did not pretend the conversation was casual anymore. Instead, he remained standing beside Marcus Reed's table boots planted firmly on the salted pavement, as if he had drawn an invisible boundary around the chair. The wind pushed another swirl of snow across the sidewalk, but Harper seemed untouched by the cold, his attention narrowing completely on the man in front of him. Marcus, however, felt the shift clearly. Encounters like this often began with small talk and ended with paperwork, and sometimes with something worse. He placed both hands calmly on the table, fingers relaxed and visible, a quiet habit learned from years of advising clients on how to survive confrontations that had little to do with law and everything to do with perception. Harper's eyes moved once more over Marcus's coat, the tailored suit beneath it, the leather briefcase at his side, and the coffee cup that had begun to release thin trails of steam into the winter air. "Mind showing me some identification?" Harper asked, the tone polite, only on the surface. Marcus met his gaze without challenge. "Am I being detained, officer?" The question landed softly but directly, and Harper's jaw tightened just enough to reveal irritation. "Just a routine check," Harper replied. "We've had incidents in this area." Marcus had heard that phrase many times. Routine, check suspicious activity matching a description. The language rarely described what was actually happening. "If I'm not being detained," Marcus said evenly, "I'd prefer to finish my coffee." A brief silence followed, thickened by the curious attention of nearby customers. Two college students seated several tables away were no longer pretending not to watch. One of them, a tall young woman with auburn hair tucked beneath a wool beanie. Her name was Lena Collins, a 20-year-old journalism student known among her classmates for recording everything she believed might matter, slowly angled her phone toward the scene. Lena had grown up watching her older brother struggle through repeated police stops that never led anywhere, and since then she had developed the reflex of documenting anything that felt wrong. She held the phone low, not trying to provoke attention, only ensuring the moment would not disappear without a record. Beside her sat Noah Patel, a slim engineering student with square glasses and a habit of nervously tapping his fingers when tense situations unfolded. Noah was not naturally confrontational, but he understood enough about technology to know that footage could change the outcome of disputes. His own phone rested face up on the table camera, quietly running. Harper noticed movement in the corner of his vision, but chose to ignore it for now. His focus returned to Marcus, whose stillness seemed to irritate him more than defiance would have. "People cooperate, things stay simple," Harper said. Marcus gave a slight nod, not agreeing, merely acknowledging the statement. Inside, he felt the familiar internal balancing act: stay calm, remain respectful, do not escalate. Years earlier, during a case involving a wrongful arrest, Marcus had watched a young client react with visible anger during a similar stop. That moment of frustration had been used later to justify force. Since then, Marcus had disciplined himself never to provide that opening. "I understand cooperation," he replied. "I also understand my rights." The wind rattled the metal chair legs again, a hollow clatter echoing across the nearly empty sidewalk. Inside the cafe, the bell chimed as someone exited, and a woman stepped outside carrying a takeout cup. She paused when she noticed the tension. The woman was Sarah Nguyen, early 30s, petite, with shoulder-length black hair and a long wool coat wrapped tightly around her frame. Sarah worked as a pediatric nurse at a nearby clinic, and years of calming anxious children had given her a natural sensitivity to rising conflict. She did not interfere, but her eyes lingered on the scene, concern visible in her expression. Harper shifted his stance slightly, leaning closer. "You said you're waiting for someone." "Business meeting." Marcus nodded. "Yes." "What kind of business?" Harper asked. The question was not casual. "Legal work," Marcus answered simply. Harper's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Lawyer." Marcus did not confirm immediately, choosing instead to hold the silence for a moment. "Yes." The answer seemed to change something, not the officer's suspicion, but the calculation behind it. Harper glanced again toward the nearby tables, and for the first time noticed Lena's phone angled carefully toward them. A faint crease appeared between his brows. He looked back at Marcus. "Then you should understand why officers ask questions." Marcus allowed himself a measured breath. "And you should understand why citizens ask whether they're being detained." The exchange was still polite, still controlled, yet the air between them felt sharper than the wind cutting across the street. Harper tapped his gloved fingers lightly against his belt, a small rhythmic motion that suggested impatience building beneath the uniform. Marcus noticed the gesture and felt the quiet tension rising another degree. Around them, the sidewalk seemed unusually quiet, the small number of customers now watching openly. Lena adjusted her phone slightly, making sure both men remained clearly in frame. Noah kept recording as well, his nervous tapping finally stopping. Sarah stood near the heater, pretending to check her messages while staying close enough to observe. Marcus took one more slow sip of coffee, the heat of it almost gone now, and set the cup down gently. He sensed that whatever happened next would define the direction of the encounter. Harper straightened, inhaled, and opened his mouth to speak again, this time with less patience than before. Officer Daniel Harper's patience finally thinned into something visible. The polite surface he had maintained only moments earlier, slipped, replaced by the sharper tone of someone who felt control beginning to slide away. The presence of cameras' phones, held discreetly yet unmistakably pointed toward the table, pressed against his nerves like a silent accusation. Harper had spent more than 2 decades in uniform, and during that time he had learned that authority depended as much on perception as on law. Losing composure in public meant losing leverage, and the realization irritated him more than Marcus Reed's calm refusal to comply. He leaned forward slightly, placing a gloved hand on the metal cafe table, with enough force to make the surface vibrate. Marcus watched the movement carefully, his eyes steady, but alert. He had seen this pattern before: raised voice, narrowing distance, pressure intended to provoke reaction. The goal was often simple: create a moment that could later be described as resistance. Marcus felt the familiar tightening in his chest again, the quiet mental reminder he had trained himself to repeat. Stay still. Let him speak. Do not give him a reason. "You're making this more complicated than it needs to be," Harper said. "All I asked for was identification," Marcus replied calmly. "I've asked whether I'm being detained." Harper's jaw flexed. For a second, neither man spoke, and the silence seemed louder than the wind moving through the plastic cafe barrier. The nearby heater flickered softly, its orange glow reflecting faintly in the polished badge on Harper's chest. A few pedestrians slowed as they passed, sensing tension without fully understanding the details. From inside the cafe, the door opened again, and a tall man stepped outside carrying a tray of takeout cups. He paused when he saw the confrontation. The man was Ethan Morales, the cafe's morning shift supervisor, 35 years old, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped dark hair and a trimmed beard that gave him a permanently serious expression. Ethan had worked in restaurants most of his life and had learned to read escalating situations quickly. Years earlier, he had intervened in a bar altercation that ended with someone injured, an experience that left him cautious but observant whenever voices rose. He didn't step forward immediately, but he remained near the entrance, watching carefully. Harper's fingers tapped once more against his belt, then suddenly he struck the table with the flat of his palm. The metallic clang rang across the sidewalk louder than expected. Marcus's coffee cup tipped, spilling a thin stream of dark liquid that spread across the table and dripped slowly onto the pavement below. Several people gasped softly, not because the action was violent, but because it crossed an invisible line between conversation and confrontation. "You think you can sit here and ignore a lawful request?" Harper said, his voice rising just enough to draw attention from across the street. "Stand up." Marcus did not move. His mind worked quickly now, assessing angles, witnesses, the number of cameras visible. Lena's phone was still raised. Noah's device remained steady. Sarah stood a few steps closer than before, her concerned expression unmistakable. Marcus knew that remaining seated could be interpreted as defiance, yet standing without legal cause could be seen as submission to unlawful pressure. Every choice mattered. "With respect," Officer Marcus said quietly, "I am not interfering with anything. I am sitting at a public table." The response, measured and polite, seemed to irritate Harper more than open argument would have. Authority, Marcus knew, often relied on emotional reactions. Calmness disrupted that rhythm. Harper leaned closer again, his shadow stretching across the table. Around them, the subtle audience grew. A delivery cyclist slowed near the curb, pretending to check his phone, while glancing repeatedly toward the scene. Inside the cafe, 2 additional customers had moved near the window, watching through the glass. The awareness of being observed created a strange stillness in the air, as though the entire block were waiting for something to break. Ethan Morales finally stepped forward, a pace, his tray now resting on a nearby table. "Officer," he said cautiously, voice respectful, "Is everything okay out here?" He did not challenge the officer, only asked the question, careful to maintain a neutral tone. Ethan's role in the cafe required diplomacy. He had learned that calm wording sometimes prevented larger incidents. Harper glanced toward him briefly, clearly annoyed by the interruption. "Everything's fine. Just routine." Ethan nodded once, though he did not step away. He remained close enough to observe a silent witness rather than an active participant. Marcus noticed the subtle shift. The presence of additional observers, staff, customers, passers-by, had begun to change the balance of the moment. Harper sensed it too, and the awareness made his movements sharper. He straightened slightly, adjusting the gloves on his hands, eyes still locked on Marcus. "You're being asked for identification," Harper said again, slower this time, each word deliberate. "Last chance to cooperate before this becomes something else." Marcus felt the phrase settle heavily in the cold air. Something else. He knew what that often meant: detention search paperwork, perhaps even force. Yet he also knew that every second now mattered. The cameras were still recording and witnesses were multiplying. He inhaled slowly, steadying himself, feeling the cold seep through the soles of his shoes, while his thoughts remained carefully controlled. "I am willing to cooperate with any lawful order," Marcus replied. "But I need to know the legal basis first." Harper stared at him for a long moment, and for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty appeared in the officer's eyes. Not hesitation exactly, but calculation. The sidewalk was no longer empty. The quiet cafe setting had transformed into an accidental stage, and every action now carried weight beyond the moment. The wind rose again, rattling the chairs and lifting a swirl of powdered snow across the pavement. Somewhere behind them, a passing car slowed slightly, its driver glancing toward the growing cluster of onlookers. The ordinary rhythm of the street had shifted, bending around the confrontation like water around a stone. Harper exhaled sharply, the sound visible in the cold air, and took half a step closer to Marcus's chair. And in that instant, everyone watching understood that the situation was about to move beyond words. The moment stretched thin like glass under pressure, as Officer Daniel Harper stood half a step from Marcus Reed's chair, his presence looming but not yet physical. Marcus sensed the shift clearly. Escalation had reached the threshold where a single action, standing too quickly, speaking too sharply, could change everything. Instead of reacting, he moved slowly, deliberately, his gloved hand sliding toward the inside pocket of his wool coat. Harper's shoulders tensed immediately, instinctively alert, but Marcus kept his movements calm and visible, withdrawing not a wallet first, but a slim leather card holder. The gesture was careful, almost ceremonial, as though he understood the significance of what would follow. Officer Marcus said quietly, "Before this continues, I believe you should see something." He opened the holder and placed it gently on the table, sliding it forward across the metal surface, still damp from spilled coffee. Inside rested a polished identification card and a professional license, both bearing his full name, Marcus Elijah Reed, Attorney at Law, Civil Rights Litigation. The lettering reflected faintly in the heater's orange glow. For the first time since the encounter began, Harper did not speak immediately. His eyes dropped to the card, then lifted back to Marcus's face, searching for something, perhaps confirmation that this situation had just shifted beyond routine authority. Marcus did not change posture or expression. He had not revealed the information to win an argument, but to clarify reality. Around them, the small crowd of witnesses seemed to lean forward collectively, sensing the turning point even before the words were spoken. Lena Collins lowered her phone slightly, not stopping the recording, but adjusting the angle to capture the identification clearly. Noah Patel beside her quietly whispered, "That changes things, though." His voice never rose above the hum of the outdoor heater. Near the cafe entrance, Ethan Morales watched closely, his arms folded across his chest, the protective instinct of a manager balancing carefully against the need not to interfere. A new figure stepped out from inside the cafe at that moment, drawn by the unusual stillness outside. Mrs. Eleanor Whitaker, a 70-year-old regular customer, known to the staff simply as Mrs. Witt, emerged slowly wrapped in a long beige coat and a knitted scarf that nearly covered her chin. She was a retired school principal, with a reputation for quiet firmness, her silver hair neatly pinned back, and her posture still straight, despite her age. Decades earlier, she had organized community meetings after a controversial school policy decision, and since then she had never ignored situations that hinted at injustice. She paused near the doorway, her eyes moving carefully from Harper to Marcus, then to the phones recording the scene, her expression thoughtful rather than alarmed. Harper finally spoke, his voice lower now, less forceful than before. "You're a lawyer." Marcus nodded. "Civil rights." The two words carried a weight that seemed to settle into the cold air between them. Harper's jaw tightened again, though this time the tension carried uncertainty rather than aggression. He glanced briefly around the sidewalk. The visible cameras, the watching customers, the cafe staff, and the awareness of the broader audience became unavoidable. Authority often functioned best in quiet spaces. Here, the silence had become too public. Marcus allowed a measured breath, his thoughts carefully aligned. He knew that revealing his profession did not end the situation. It merely changed its direction. In his years of legal practice, he had learned that moments like this rarely resolved instantly. Instead, they lingered, replayed later in official reports, disciplinary hearings, or courtroom testimony. He met Harper's eyes again, not challenging, not triumphant, simply steady. "I'm here for a scheduled meeting," Marcus said. "I'd like to continue waiting." The simplicity of the statement contrasted sharply with the tension that had filled the last several minutes. Harper shifted his weight slightly, one hand resting against his belt, his gaze moving once more toward the identification card. Behind him, the sound of a passing car slowed briefly, the driver glancing toward the cluster of onlookers before continuing down the street. The sidewalk now felt less like a random encounter and more like a documented moment already leaving the boundaries of the block. Across social media platforms, unknown to most of those standing there, Lena's earlier footage had already begun uploading automatically through her university's high-speed mobile network, the first clips quietly spreading beyond the physical scene. Marcus did not know this yet, but Harper sensed the possibility. He exhaled slowly, a visible cloud of breath rising in the cold air, and straightened slightly. For a brief second, the aggressive posture that had defined the encounter seemed to soften into something closer to calculation. Mrs. Whitaker stepped a little closer to the heater, still silent, her presence calm yet unmistakably observant, while Sarah Nguyen remained nearby watching with the attentive stillness of someone prepared to speak if necessary. The environment had shifted. The conversation was no longer private, the outcome no longer entirely within one man's control. Harper looked once more at Marcus, then at the card on the table, and finally at the phones pointed in their direction. Something unspoken passed across his expression, a recognition that the situation had moved beyond the simplicity of a routine street inquiry. The wind rose again, carrying a thin spray of snow across the pavement, as the officer reached down slowly, not to grab Marcus, but to lift the identification card for a closer look. And in that small, measured movement, the confrontation crossed into a new phase, one where authority would have to answer questions as well. The confrontation did not explode the way many expected. Instead, it dissolved slowly, like frost melting under cautious sunlight. Officer Daniel Harper returned Marcus Reed's identification card without speaking for several seconds, his expression unreadable. The earlier tension, the sharp tone, the authoritative stance had shifted into something quieter but heavier, a recognition that the moment was no longer controlled solely by him. Around them, The sidewalk witnesses remained still, as though everyone sensed the scene had crossed an invisible line from confrontation into consequence. Marcus slid the card holder back into his coat pocket with the same deliberate calm he had maintained from the beginning. His movements were unhurried, not theatrical, simply measured. Years of courtroom experience had taught him that dignity often spoke louder than argument. He reached for a napkin and wiped the remaining coffee from the table, a small gesture that felt strangely symbolic, restoring order where disruption had been forced. Harper watched the motion, his jaw tightening briefly, then loosening again as if he were deciding what posture to adopt next. The phones recording nearby remained raised, silent witnesses that could not be ordered away. A police cruiser turned the corner at the end of the block, just then, its tires crunching lightly over the thin layer of snow. It slowed as it approached the cafe, not with sirens, but with the cautious curiosity of officers responding to a situation already reported through dispatch calls from passers-by. From the driver's side stepped Sergeant Linda Alvarez, a tall woman in her early 40s with olive-toned skin, sharp cheekbones, and dark hair pulled tightly into a regulation bun. Her uniform was immaculate, but what distinguished her most was her posture, balanced, attentive, the posture of someone who had spent years correcting tense situations before they escalated. Earlier in her career, Alvarez had supervised an internal review unit that handled misconduct complaints, an assignment that shaped her reputation as firm but methodical. She approached the gathering with measured steps, her eyes scanning the scene once before focusing on Harper. "Officer Harper," she said evenly, her voice carrying authority without volume. "What's going on?" Harper shifted slightly, clearing his throat. "Routine check, Sergeant. Situation's under control." Alvarez's gaze moved briefly to Marcus, then to the nearby witnesses holding their phones, then back to Harper. She had handled enough field incidents to recognize when a routine check had already grown beyond routine. "I'll speak with you in a moment," she replied, her tone neutral. She turned toward Marcus. "Sir, are you all right?" Marcus nodded. "Yes, Sergeant." That was all he said, but the simplicity of the answer carried weight. Alvarez gave a short nod, then gestured subtly for Harper to step aside with her near the cruiser. Their conversation was quiet enough that the words could not be heard, yet the posture of both officers made the exchange clear. Alvarez speaking calmly, Harper listening with visible tension. The crowd did not disperse. Instead, people remained where they stood, aware that the outcome of the moment mattered. Lena Collins lowered her phone for the first time since the confrontation began, glancing at the screen to confirm the recording had saved successfully. Noah Patel exhaled slowly beside her, the tension in his shoulders easing. Sarah Nguyen returned her takeout cup to the cafe counter, but remained near the window, still watching. Even Mrs. Whitaker, wrapped in her long coat, stayed close to the heater, her steady presence reflecting the quiet solidarity of the witnesses who had chosen not to walk away. Several minutes later, Harper returned to the sidewalk, his expression controlled but subdued. He did not resume the confrontation. Instead, he gave Marcus a brief nod that hovered somewhere between acknowledgement and retreat. Without further comment, he turned toward the cruiser, where Alvarez was already speaking into her radio, documenting the call. The moment ended, not with raised voices, but with procedural quiet, the kind that often signals official review. Marcus remained seated for another minute, allowing the tension to drain from the space around him. He picked up his now cooling coffee and took a slow sip, tasting more bitterness than warmth. He knew what would follow: reports, statements, footage requests, perhaps formal inquiries. Encounters like this rarely disappeared once recorded. He did not feel victorious. He felt steady the way one feels after stepping through a storm that has not yet fully passed. Ethan Morales approached the table carefully. "Sir, I'm sorry about the spill," he said, offering a fresh cup. Marcus accepted it with a small smile. "Thank you." Across the street, traffic resumed its normal rhythm, and pedestrians began moving again, the brief gathering dissolving back into the everyday flow of the city. Yet the incident had already traveled beyond the block. Lena's uploaded video continued circulating, picked up by local community groups and neighborhood forums, the first wave of attention that would later prompt formal review by department supervisors. Within days, the footage would be included in an internal investigation examining Harper's conduct during the encounter. Weeks later, the result became official. Officer Daniel Harper was placed on administrative suspension, pending disciplinary action for procedural violations related to the stop. The announcement was brief, buried in a departmental bulletin, but the impact traveled quietly through the precinct. Authority, once unquestioned, now carried a note of scrutiny. On the morning the decision was finalized, Marcus Reed passed the same cafe again on his way to another meeting. Snow still lined the edges of the street, though thinner now, beginning to melt under early sunlight. He paused only long enough to take a sip of coffee before continuing down the sidewalk, leaving behind the place where a routine morning had briefly revealed something larger. He did not look back. He had never believed justice needed applause. Sometimes it arrived quietly, carried not by celebration, but by record patience and the simple fact that someone had been watching when it mattered. Sometimes justice does not arrive with thunder. Sometimes it comes quietly through a camera that kept recording a stranger who chose not to look away and the courage to remain calm when the world expects anger. Maybe that is how miracles often work, not always as something impossible, but as small moments where truth is protected, dignity is preserved, and the right people happen to be present at the right time. Many believe those moments are not accidents, that God moves gently through everyday lives, guiding events in ways we only understand later. If this story touched your heart, take a moment today to stand for fairness in your own life. Speak kindly, protect someone's dignity, and remember that even a simple act helping recording the truth or refusing to stay silent can change someone's future. Share this story so more people can remember that courage does not need to be loud to be powerful. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from. We read every message. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story of justice, hope, and humanity. May God bless you, protect your families, and fill your days with quiet miracles, the kind that remind us we are never truly alone.